Thanks everyone for coming along. I'll talk today about the work that a group of us did called the External Data Quality Panel for the 2018 Census, assessing the work that Stats New Zealand did after the census turned out to be not quite what they wanted it to be. And I'll talk a little bit about the panel sort of partway through the talk, but we always had to distinguish ourselves from the other panel, which talked about what went wrong with the census. And whenever I talk to people about it, the first question is what went wrong, which I'm not going to talk about too much because I don't know too much about what went wrong, they do. But I will touch on a little bit about what went wrong as much as we discuss it in our meetings. But I'll talk a little bit about the New Zealand Census, officially called the New Zealand Census of Population and Dwellings. It is an official count of people in New Zealand at any one particular point in time, but also more importantly broken down by various stratifiers: age, sex, ethnicity, region, community. As we discussed in the panel, if you just wanted a count of the country, you wouldn't need to do a census. A well-designed survey will do that for you. What a census does, it describes small communities really well to help with planning at the small community level. Also in the census, and censuses around the world do this slightly differently, it's actually a social survey as well, or a whole population social survey. So you get detailed social, cultural and socioeconomic information about the total New Zealand population and groups within the population. Censuses in New Zealand have been undertaken since 1851, and since 1881 they've been every 5 years, barring some mishaps along the way. And those mishaps were, for instance, they didn't have a census during the Great Depression, they didn't have a census during the Second World War. The 1946 census was brought forward to 1945, apparently because they were redoing the way electorates were, boundaries were decided, and they wanted to get a census in time before the election in 1946, apparently. And then the Christchurch earthquake caused the 2011 census to be rerun. So many people, including myself, had already filled out their census form in 2011, and then they had to rerun it again in 2013. Since 1966, censuses have been held on the first Tuesday in March of the census year. And the reason for that apparently is because March is the month in which people move least in New Zealand, and Tuesday is the day where people are more likely to be at home than any other day. So that's why they've always chosen it to be a Tuesday in March. And the most recent census was undertaken on March the 6th, 2018, but given, as I'll get onto shortly, it was a digital first census, you can't really say it was done at a particular point in time because people did it over a period of time. And they're still chasing, you could do it before that date, and they're still chasing people after that date. And anyone interested in the history of the census can go to that link there. Census is important for a number of different things. One of which, in New Zealand and other countries, is to determine how many of the electorates there are and what the electoral boundaries are. And this is one thing that was a main chapter, actually, in the first report that we put out about whether, with the way the census went, whether it could still be used to determine the number of electorates. And I'll tell you later what we thought about that. Also for planning at the central and local government levels to see what services they need in a particular area based on the populations and what those populations are doing and how those populations move. Allocating resources from central government to local areas for academic and market research. Also statistical benchmarks, so using the census as the main source of truth about what the rate of something is, such as unemployment or income levels or something like that. As a data frame to select samples for social surveys. So these are the sorts of things that Stats New Zealand do post-census, where they run a survey after the census on a sample of the population where they use the census as a sampling frame. Even though it never has captured the entire population, it gets pretty close, but never the entire population, but more of the population than does, say, the electoral roll, which we use as a sampling frame for surveys. And for many other different things. That's just a snapshot of what we covered off when we wrote about this a little bit in our first report. And a report on the census suggests that every dollar invested in the census generates a net benefit of $5 in the economy. So it's a very important thing, and it's a very cost-effective thing to be doing. and something that you really want to get right. There are also obligations under Te Tiriti o Waitangi relating to the production of official statistics in relation to Māori and iwi. And independently of the census, Stats New Zealand has responsibilities to support Māori wellbeing and development on their own terms and have equity as citizens. And as I mentioned before, they called it 18 census, they called it a change census. It was a digital first census, which meant that they didn't send out paper questionnaires to everyone as they have in every census up until that point. They mailed access codes that people could use to go online and fill out their census. They only used paper questionnaires as a backup if people requested them. And what we discovered as well is they made lots, because of this and also for other reasons as well, they made lots of other little changes to the census, all I would think which coalesced into making it not work the way it should do. Okay, so what happened? What this table shows here is the population response rates estimated in 2018 and actual from the post-enumeration surveys in 2013 and 2006 for the last 3 censuses. And you can see a couple of things here. One is that, let's focus on the individual form column there. That means you've filled out a census form, essentially. If you ask someone, did you fill out the census, and they say yes, they're in that column there. 1 out of 6 people did not fill out a census form. That partial form there, that's where people exist on a household form. So someone in their household has made a list of people in the household, but that's all you have on information about those people on that list. Just that they were in the household, nothing else. None of the content of the census. In 2018, compared to 2013, 2006, it was far more partial forms than there had been previously. It was very rare to just have a partial form in previous censuses. So now, as well as missing a lot of people entirely, they missed 12.5% of the population entirely, they also have partial information on a substantial fraction of the population. And if you look at this for subgroups of the population, Māori, Asian, Pacific, and the young, 15 to 29-year-olds, you can see that the response rates are lower still for some groups. So if you're Māori or Pacific, there was a 1 in 3 chance you did not fill out a census form, and a far larger chance that any census information on you at all was only on the household form. Similarly for 15 to 29-year-olds. And there were variations by geography as well. So what I've got here is a graph of estimated census response rates for regional councils, those things like Auckland, Waikato, Canterbury, Southland, that sort of thing. Territorial authorities, Auckland is self-territorial authority, but Wellington City, Christchurch City, districts. Statistical area level 2, think of those as suburbs. In cities, there are suburbs about 3,000 to 4,000 people, slightly smaller in rural areas. Statistical area 1, they are small areas of about 200 people. The old measure, which they're still using and I'll get onto a bit later, called mesh block, SA2s are essentially 2 mesh blocks jammed together, or sometimes 1 mesh block if the mesh block is big enough. And what you see here is most regions had less than 90% response rate. There was only 1 region, which I think was Canterbury, that had greater than 90% response rate for that region. Many territorial authorities had less than 90% response rate and some less than 75%. And a substantial fraction of suburbs, small communities, and small areas around your neighbourhood that had less than 75% response rate. 11% of suburbs, shall we call them, and 12.5% of little neighbourhoods. And drilling down a bit further, what we did in our our second report, yes. We looked at where particular small areas, that's the SA2 areas, let's call them suburbs, had very low response rate. And there were 24 of those in the country, which is about 1% of all those suburbs, that had less than 60% census completion. Many of these are in Auckland. And the ones that are in Auckland are mostly in South Auckland. Now, I thought to myself about this, if I was to stop my talk now and walk out to Simon Street, I could get a bus to these places and go around those communities asking for census forms. It's not that difficult to get to these places. These are places that are not that difficult to get to, but with the change in census methodologies, they didn't respond at a very high rate. And so you've got areas of Auckland that are particularly poorly served by the census. And other areas as well. Northland was badly hit, Gisborne was badly hit, Bay of Plenty. Okay, just one slide on this. As I said, people always ask what went wrong, and we're not quite the people to be asking about that. But we did, a few of our meetings were devoted to talking through what went wrong. So there's a report by the other group, the Independent Review of New Zealand's 2018 Census, Murray Jack and Connie Grazadier, and they had a whole report on what went wrong, and I'm just summarising some of the things that they come up with. One is they didn't have enough field staff employed in time. So they employed they contracted another agency to do the field work, and at the time of the start of the census, they only had 2/3 or something like that of people employed that they should have employed, and they got there in the end, but well after they should have done. The importance of paper forms in this model was underestimated. I don't think they realised how many they would need. The request for paper forms often went unheeded, so people asked, say, hey, I don't want to do my census online, I want to fill it out on paper, can you send me one? And they never got that paper form. And sometimes, and we know this a little bit with how New Zealand Post is at the moment, the forms took a long time to get there. And when that happens, people just give up. If it's a census 2 weeks ago, even if it turns up, you think, well, the census is gone now. The same online access code was required for each individual within the household to complete their respective forms, that had to be passed around. Also, if you're thinking about it, if you're in a household that's only got one device, and you've got 6 people in the household, for instance, which will happen, you'd have to pass that device around everyone serially to get them to complete the census. And the other thing, and this is just unbelievable to me, but a form couldn't be saved. If you didn't complete your census response in a session, you had to start over again. Now, if there was anything going to stop me filling out my census form, that sort of thing would be it, where I had to go back and do it again, because you might have 3/4 of the way through. Life got in the way, and what do? They tend to rate their communication engagement strategies as being okay, but it's clearly they didn't engage enough communities in the right areas. Strategies put in place for non-private dwellings didn't work. Non-private dwellings are things like, hotel blocks, hotels and motels, prisons, defence establishments. They had a plan that worked through, I think, the leaders, CEOs, whatever you call them, of prisons and defence establishments to make sure that the census forms were filled out. That didn't work, and so they had to come up with another strategy after the census has happened. I'll go on to that shortly. And the other thing is, with everything else that was going on, they decided to not follow up partial responses. So if they knew that a household responded, but there were people on that household form for whom they didn't get a census form, they decided not to chase it up. And you can see how that would have response in that increased number of partial forms this time compared to last. And a number of other different things. If you really want to know, you can go to that report there. Okay, fixes. Well, one of them was to say, hey, we've got a problem here. We need to get some independent advice on what to do. And so they put together us, the External Data Quality Panel, and that's Dick Bedford and Alison Reid here. Dick Bedford at AUT, Alison Reid at Auckland Council. Our co-chairs, Len Cook, who's a former government statistician, both here and in the UK, actually. Ian Cope, who worked on censuses in the UK. Tahu Kukatai, who's at Waikato University as an academic and expert in Māori data sovereignty. Donna Colmack, who's an academic at Otago and at Auckland, who works with health statistics, also an expert in Māori data and Māori data sovereignty. Thomas Lumley here from the University of Auckland, who's a professor of biostatistics, and myself, I guess, knows a little bit about census data and working with administrative data. So our job was to advise on whether the methodologies that Stats New Zealand used to produce the information that they finally produced are based on sound research and a strong evidence base. Whether their approaches to data processing methodology, increased use of admin data sources, which I'll get onto shortly, affect the quality of the data. We probably spent most of our time on that, I guess. Data issues that may affect the usefulness of the data for Māori and iwi as treaty partners, and any other quality issues people need to consider when using time. And just as an aside, one thing, I don't know what Dick and Alison think, but one thing I certainly found, I think others on the panel as well, is we came in August and we were supposed to finish in April the next year when they were supposed to have their first release. That was delayed to September. We were supposed to produce one report. We ended up producing 3 by February this year. And they weren't quite ready to go with the fixes when we first got there in August 2018. I don't think they'd quite set up the organisational structure to say, hey, look, we've got a problem, this is what we need to decide what we need to do, and let's go ahead and do it. They were still exploring what was going wrong, and that, I think, is what we dealt with all through actually the rest of 2018, to be honest. And really it wasn't until 2019 that there was a firm idea of what they were going to do, and we could make an assessment of that. I can probably do without a slide. Okay, so one of their main fixes was to say, okay, we've got this thing called the integrated data infrastructure. And what it is, it's a linking together of administrative data sources, plus the 2000 census, plus a few surveys and a few other bits and pieces at the individual level. It's not set up such that you, in an obvious way, get a count of the people in the population, but you can use it to determine who is in the population at any one time by who is accessing particular services over a period of time. There's this thing called the IDI spine, which is essentially a list of people who have ever been resident in New Zealand. From the IDI spine, they created something called the IDI ERP Shore, the IDI Estimated Resident Population Shore. These are people that they're pretty sure lived in New Zealand at the time of the census. And it's distinguished from the IDI ERP, which had slightly looser conditions. The IDI ERP Shore meant you had to have touched 2 sectors, I think, in the previous 2 years or something like that. So this gives you an estimate of who's in the population. What they did then, the other thing to say is, and there was a bit of a terminology debate that went on between us, say, we're going to link to the IDI. What do you mean? The IDI is anonymous. You can't link to the IDI. And what they really meant is behind the IDI are all the identifying information about people that allows the data sources to be linked to each other. So what they wanted to do then is link the census to the IDI to see who in the census is in the IDI and who they missed. And based on who they missed, add those people in. And they did this. They linked the 2018 census records to people in the IDI spine. And what they found is they could link 97.5% of people. They estimated that 1.2% of the census people could be missed. And if you add those two together, you don't get 100. And what that suggests is there'll be people filling out their census that won't be in the IDI spine, which makes sense. You wouldn't necessarily have had to touch services in the country to have filled out a census form. And people fill out a census form who are just passing through anyway. And because the linkage is deterministic and probabilistic, they estimate some of these to be incorrect, less than 1%. So the deal is here, we've got census information of this amount of people. We want to get census or information on the remainder of the people in the country, and for that we're going to grab people and their characteristics from the IDI. And in doing so, you add households, and you're adding people to households where you've got households where you know about some people, not others, but also in adding entirely new households you knew nothing about. That was the main fix. A secondary fix, is one I alluded to before, is that, and I still can't believe this didn't work, by the way. I would have thought prisons would have been one of the easiest places to collect information from other work I've done. But anyway, they relied on the heads of the prisons and defence forces to collect census information. It didn't work. Then what they did is they got permission to, or they asked for corrections to provide data from their admin sources within the prisons and within the defence forces about the people who were living there. And they passed that on. And in doing this, I should take a step back. You can find out about prisoners and defence force people from the IDI, but you don't have very good information about what prison they're in or what defence establishment they're in, which is why they needed to go directly there. And in so doing, they added nearly half the prisoners that are in the final census file that they came up with were got from this method, and about 20% of the Defence Force members who are in the final census file they got from. Okay, and this is this describes the final census file that they put together. And what you can see here is you've got 89% of people in the final census file were from the census some way, shape or form, either from an individual form, an individual listed on a household form, or where they did some field enumeration of people who are homeless, handful of those. Then what they did is they added in people who added in whole households of people, and they added from information in the administrative integrated data infrastructure records, added 3% that way. Then they added some people at private dwellings who had already responded, as well as the prison and penal system and defence establishment people, and that adds another 0.6% of people. These are people where they are pretty sure where they live at the household and dwelling level. Then, that wasn't good enough because you're still missing quite a few people in the population. They had an assessment of people in the IDI about where they lived in the country. If they didn't think that assessment was good enough to put them directly into a household, but they did think that assessment was good enough to put them in a mesh block, that's an area of about 30 houses, they did that. So there are 357,000 people who are in the census file, but they are not in a dwelling or a household. They're in a small area called a mesh block, and I don't know if this is my terminology, other people, I like to think of sort of floating above the mesh block, but not actually in any one house in there. But they're in the census file. And you can imagine that this is going to cause damage to family and household variables, for instance, because you've got people who should be in households that aren't, so your estimates of number of people per household are necessarily going to be underestimates, etc. Anyway, they're in there, and if they didn't do that, they'd have Okay, so what this meant was the final census usual resident population of 4.7 million is estimated to cover 98.6% of the estimated New Zealand population at 6th of March 2018. And the way they did that, the way they normally estimate the number of people they get is from a post-enumeration survey. To my knowledge, they've still not released the results of the post-enumeration survey. Instead, they use something called dual system estimation, which basically is, well, we've got a census is one estimate of who's in the population, we've got the IDI, Sure is another estimate, and there's overlap between the two and non-overlap. Based on that, we think there's about that number of people in the country, 4.768 million. And the 4.6998 million is 98.6% of that. That undercount of nearly 69,000 represents 1.4% of the estimated New Zealand population. And that's a lower undercount that they got at either 2013 or in 2006. But unlike 2013 2006, they added 500,000 people to the population after the census from the administrative sources. Okay, so they got there, but not from the census directly, And of course there are differences in who they got from where. So what this shows here is the blue bars show where they got that census bit of information for those ethnic groups directly from the Census 2018 form. The mustard coloured one is where they got it from added to the IDI within a household, and the red coloured one is where they added to the IDI. They couldn't put them in the household, they had to just hover them in a mesh block. And you can see there, if you just relied on census information, you would overestimate the proportion of the population. You'd undercount everyone, but you'd overestimate the portion of the population who are European, and you'd underestimate the portion of the population who are Māori. That dotted line is where the two put together. And what that also shows is, when you're looking at information for Māori and Pacific people, they are far more likely to be got from these other sources than from the census information. Affects Mila hardly at all, and the Asian population not very much. And we know this, of course, from what I showed you earlier about this. Okay, from a purely data quality point of view, we endorse these statistical approaches used to mitigate non-response. A census with 70% missing was not going to be a goer. You could not live with that as your final census file. So the mitigation worked to get the census file that counts most New Zealanders. However, in discussions with the panel, we thought we could not, in all conscience, rightly say that we approve this data quality approach, which we do, without saying a little bit about, well, whether they should be doing that, and talk about issues around social license, cultural license and Māori data sovereignty. Noting that not many people, if any, well, no New Zealanders knew that they were going to do this because no New Zealanders expected that the census was going to be the way it was going to be. There wasn't this plan to use admin data to the extent that it was used. And there hasn't really been any discussion with New Zealanders about what they think about that. When the first release of census data happened in September last year, there was a collective shrug about this, I think it's fair to say, but that only really got attention from those who were interested. We think that there should have been consultation with all New Zealanders about what they think about using their data that they provided by going to a doctor or by getting a benefit or by doing one or other, or by enrolling in education for the purpose of census, because they didn't know that and it wasn't. We had various questions about legality, ethics and social license. They confirmed with us that in their discussions with their legal team that yes, according to Stats New Zealand legal advice, they are able to do this. Does enjoy social license, that is tacit approval from the New Zealand public, and that I think it's unclear whether it does or not. In a report about social license for Stats New Zealand's activities generally by a private research company a couple of years ago, they said that Stats New Zealand should provide clear notice to the public about the retention and use of names and addresses and integration with the IDI and explain that this is legitimate and adds value. That hasn't happened with regards to the census. And as I said, the individual dwelling census form didn't contain this information that this was likely to happen. And we point out that retaining the trust of Māori is especially important, given that Māori have lower levels of institutional trust, but are among those most impacted by the extensive use of administrative data for census mitigation. As I said, just under 2/3 of Māori filled out a census form, meaning if we went data on them in the final census. And just going on one step further, it's not clear that people in New Zealand understand the extent of data sets that are linked to the census, nor that it will affect their willingness to provide data if they didn't understand. Now, we don't know what the New Zealanders would think, but that's our point. We should find out what New Zealanders think. Consent from prisoners and those in Defence Force was not obtained from the individuals concerned. Their data was provided by their organisation, which we were very uneasy about. It's also not clear whether there was cultural licence, that is collective mandate for the trusted use of Māori data based on the trust or lack of trust that iwi and Māori treaty partners have with government institutions such as Stats New Zealand. All of that we didn't think was covered off. Okay, so fix 1 was add people in. Fix 2 was go get the people from prisons and defence places that you couldn't get with your other mechanisms. The third one is to say, okay, where the data wasn't available from the census 2018, let's get data from elsewhere. And it was sometimes administrative data, but it was sometimes other sources. They had up to 3. And for what they decided for each variable is if we can't get data from the census 2018, where should we get information from? And that was a different mix of things for each variable. And sometimes it was one of these things, sometimes it was 2, sometimes it was all 3. One is they could get data from the previous census. And you'd do that for things that either you think didn't change at all or changed very little. One is, well, they added the people from the administrative data, let's get some of their information as well. And that works well, as I'll go into shortly, where the information in the admin data is capturing exactly the same thing as you would have got from the census, but doesn't work so well when it doesn't. And then they used imputation, a method of imputation called near-neighbour imputation, the concise near-neighbour imputation, where they said, let's find someone who looks like you, and where you don't have information on something, we'll grab their information and use it for you. Now, the other thing to say about this is this wasn't just where the census wasn't completed. Also, when people fill out the census, they sometimes put an answer that can't be understood by the people processing the data, or they skip over a question or something like that. When that happened, they also went to other sources. And one of the implications of that is there's far less missing information at a census variable level in 2018 than previous censuses. And you really need to be cautious when you're comparing across time. That's saying, oh look, all these categories seem to have gone up in the 2018 census. That's because they've all gone up because there's no information category anymore. And the point that we made is this creates a very different census file. It's a census file, but it's not one that we've ever had before. It's a mix from completely different sources. What we did is Thomas actually did this, is we put together a series of graphs. If you go to that link there, you can go there, and for any particular variable, you can see where the data was sourced from. And you can break that down by region, by ethnicity, and also shows, and this is scary, the lowest SA2 in each region. Next 10 minutes talk about data quality implications. Did the final census file provide an accurate count of the population? We say yes. The population enumeration survey results are not yet available, but the dual system estimation, which has been used widely elsewhere, using the IDI, ERP, SURE, and the census combined, suggest only a small undercount and accurate counts down to the TALB, that's Territorial Authority and Local Board, where you break Auckland up into local boards, but everywhere else you use territorial authorities. Distributions by age and sex also appear to be accurate. Did the 2018 census file allow for the number of electorates to be accurately determined? We also say yes, and I'll explain why. Just some background here, because there's a moderately complicated formula to work out the electorate size in New Zealand. First of all, you need to work out the Māori electoral population, which is the electoral Māori descent usual resident population, which is derived from the census and will be affected by people you add in or choose not to add in, multiplied by the percent of enrolled Māori voters choosing the Māori role. We're using the most up-to-date estimate of that, and that is 52% currently. So you take what the census estimate of the Māori electoral population is, multiply that by 0.52, and that is the Māori electoral population. The general electoral population is the census usually resident population count, again, which is impacted by who they add and don't add to the census file, minus the Māori electoral population. The number of South Island general electorates is fixed at 16, according to the Electoral Act of 1993. And because that, once you work out what the South Island general electorate population is, and you divide it by 16, you come up with something called the South Island quota, and that South Island quota determines the size of electorates around the country. The number of the Māori electorate population divided by the South Island quota is the number of Māori electorates. The North Island general electorate population divided by the South Island quota is the number of general electorates in the North Island. And the Electoral Commission need to stick to this with a leeway of plus or minus 5%. So electorates don't have to be exactly the same size to the dot, but within 5% of each other. And you might want to do that where this electorate has been this way for a certain time, and it's 3% more than you want the electoral population to be, but rather than change. Okay, so going back to our people hovering over mesh blocks, when Stats New Zealand decided to add those people in, they had a model that determined whether the knowledge of a person's location was accurate enough to add to the census file. Where 1 is they're absolutely certain that the person lives in this mesh block, and where 0 means it's a guess. And they chose 0.5 for their cutoff there. But they could have chosen something else, right? What this shows, and this is work done by a data science company that they contracted to do this work, called Loves Data. And there's a report called, which I think is still unpublished. I don't think anyone can get that. I think it's just for Stats New Zealand. Sensitivity Analysis of 2018 Census for Electoral Boundaries. What they said is, okay, what if they chose to not add anyone in? And what if they chose to add in all the people that they're not really that sure whether they're in that mesh block at all? And of course, knowing where someone lives is really important for electoral purposes because you need to design the electorates. And in an extreme turn of luck, it turns out that regardless of what you decide, the number of Māori electorates is always 7 because it ranges from 6.5 something up to 7.3 something. And we were in the room at the time and we asked them, do you realise how lucky you are that this that just happened to turn out to always between 6.5 and 7? They said, yeah, we are. But anyway, point is, regardless of the threshold chosen, regardless of the decisions that Stats New Zealand made about who to put in the census file or not, the result is always 7 Māori electorates. And we did some additional analysis of this and showed that actually you'd have to be assuming unrealistic population change of the Māori descent population for it to be anything other than 7, like only 1% change since the last census, which is far less than population growth. It would have to be that for there to be less than 7 and 25% growth for there to be more than 7. So it's 7. What about North Island general electorates? So they did the same thing here, and here it mattered a little bit. Okay, so based on the threshold they chose, It matters on whether there are 49 or 48 general electorates in the North Island. Last election there were 48. They chose 0.5, which is up here, suggesting that there should be 49. So here the threshold matters a little. Most thresholds suggest 49. Only strict thresholds where you have a really strict criteria about whether you should add people to the census file or not at the mesh block level would suggest there should be 48. And the Electoral Act 1993 enables the government statistician to exercise a degree of discretion here, and this would include the selection of alpha, and 0.5 seemed reasonable to us. So we could quibble about this. In the lead up to this announcement, there was all sorts of talk about whether National would challenge this, and then they didn't. Partly, I think, because Thomas Lumley was sitting in the room at the time and saying, well, you know, if he thinks it's right, then it's probably right. But anyway, you can see there that does make a little bit of difference there, but you'd have to have really strict threshold and thereby not have a census population that's less than it is currently with greater undercount for there to be only 48. Okay, just quickly on the alternative data sources. From a data quality point of view, I've mentioned about the social license and ethics and private and legality point of view. It's a good thing that they added people there because you reduce the census undercount. And we certainly were of the view that the use of alternative data sources is better than doing nothing, but we're also of the view that it's not as good as if you'd actually managed to get census from the whole population like you should have done. And a paper 5 years ago now suggested that a census based on admin data is not yet possible, and it's still not possible now. But depending on what there are issues with each of those data sources. Starting with the admin data, one of the issues here is contemporaneity. So the admin data is just a running record of contacts you've had with various sectors, whereas a census is a snapshot at a particular point in time of what the population is like. And you really have to be, if things change, you have to be sure that the admin data is giving you the up-to-date information. And this becomes important, of course, with addresses and where to place people in the census file. And the other issue there is, as anyone who's worked with the IDI will know, if you want information accurate as at March 2018, you really have to wait 6 months before those data are made available for you to use. So going forward, if Stats New Zealand are going to do this, they really have to put that into their planning as to when they have the information to add people from admin data. Anyway, these things may be out of date. So a value of ethnicity from education data might have been supplied in December 2017, not far before March 2018, but that's from an enrolment at the start of the year, and that itself may have carried forward from where they had previously enrolled. So the data itself may be quite out of date. Admin data, as I mentioned before, may not measure exactly the same thing. Taxable income from IID is not the same as disposable income reported at the census level. They correlate okay. And just in terms of variables that used admin data, there's a list of them there that used for the population, this differed by subgroups of the population, more than 10% of admin data were used. Sector of ownership, industry, workplace address, income, sector of landlord, usual resident address, weekly paid rent by households, age and sex, which you can get pretty accurately from admin data. In terms of Census 2013, as I said, they use those for variables which do not change over time or change very little over time. The problem there is where things do change, you'll underestimate it. And researchers are often interested in the people that do change, and so you're actually reducing that group and you've got a bias group of those that do change. Here's a list, to give you an example, here's a list of things they use the 2000 census data for in high numbers. The first one is an unusual one because there was a plan to use the 2013 census to work out where people lived 5 years ago, always. They didn't ask that question at the census. They'd always planned to look back 5 years for that. And in so doing, they can only link like 83% of people, so that has got like 17% missing or something in that variable. Birthplace probably doesn't change. Years since arrival in New Zealand, you just take what you knew last time and added 5 to it, so that's fine. Others do change though. Religion. Well, I've got a PhD student now looking at moving from religion to non-religion and back again as it influences later mortality. And now she won't be able to do that now, or less able to do that now, if you've got religion carried forward from the 2013 data. People's reports of their ethnicity change, the languages they speak changes over time. Smoking, another classic example. Smoking is fairly stable, but you really are interested in the people who change. And you've got less change now because of this approach. and 7% of the overall. Okay, the imputation. So the imputation system they used was called CanSciS, the Canadian Census Edit and Imputation System. As I say, they've got a model there which matches people up to people who are like them, and you grab the person most like them, and for particular variables you grab those persons' characteristics. The thing about imputation, why they liked it I think, and we had various arguments about this, is that it produced an unbiased estimate. So for large counts at least, you should get accurate counts. So even if you get particular individuals wrong, your overall count will be right. But you're getting particular individuals wrong. So if you are doing analyses of these data, it can affect your estimates of the bivariate associations between analyses. And in slight, well not partly unpredictable ways. It could increase the estimates of association with the variables that are included in the model that they use for the imputation. So you're duplicating up on people who already have that association, essentially. But for things that aren't in the imputation model, you may expect it to decrease the estimation of association. And they use imputation heavily in some cases. So occupation's around 20% imputation, for instance. So not your occupation, someone else's. Work and labour force status, main means of travel to work, main means of travel to education. And we've got Natalia here, who's going to be looking at seeing the extent to which this imputation affects the New Zealand. They did their quality estimation. Based on various determinants, they came up with an estimate of whether particular variables were, and if I had more time I'd go into this, but I don't, so I'll just take you to this. And what you can see there is there really is a kind of a bell curve for the quality of variables in 2018, whereas at 2013 there was nothing worse than moderate. Now we've got what they do with those. There are two personal variables that have been rated by Stats New Zealand having data of overall very poor quality. These are iwi affiliation and absentees from the household, and absentees I think become less important with they do become less important with the way they've constructed the census file now because you've got the admin backup. Now, iwi was something that we ruled out very early. There does not appear to be a robust, reliable way to address missing iwi data in Census 2018. They will not release assessment census variable for iwi, a count of the iwi population in New Zealand. Because there ain't good sources elsewhere to get the iwi information from. If you don't get it from the census, you can't get it from anywhere, basically. And you can't borrow last census's information because people change their affiliations, and moreover, they actually introduced a new standard in 2017 which added more iwi to there, so they just wouldn't get counted. Because of reasons I went through before, individual ones, I thought all their family. Yeah. And Stats New Zealand are reviewing these ratings at the moment. We haven't seen the outcome of their review, but they're reviewing these ratings. But you can imagine why they're poor. The main one being, there's those 350,000 people that you can't put into households or families. They're just hovering over mesh blocks. That's got to do something to estimates of family size and other sorts of things. And moreover, a disproportionate number of those are from areas where Māori and Pacific populations are high. Just briefly as well, there was also, their coding went really badly wrong with the family and household information at 2018, where if you look at it, there's just these weird changes and weird things where ages between partners were odd, and a large number of same-sex couples than you would expect given the population. Some very old children and some very young parents and some weird other things that were going on. And part of this was because they did not have devoted staff to the coding. They expected far less coding than they had last time. And given everything else that was going on, they decided variables have been rated as poor. I'll go through this quickly. We ourselves rated some other variables. So we did our own ratings in Stats New Zealand, and we mostly agreed with them, except at sort of lower levels of classifications, or for where they'd say, oh, this is good at the moderate or high at the overall level. We tend to say, well, yes, but that's because you've got so many Europeans in the population. If you look down at Māori and Pacific, they tend to be lower. Dick, you did this work. Level 4 ethnicity classification for the Mila ethnicities is poor quality. Under the languages, Te Reo language is considered poor. Smoking for Māori and Pacific and Mila population is poor because of over-reliance of last census's data. Hours worked in employment for Pacific is poor, nearly 40% imputation. Occupation, there were so many groups that I decided were poor for that I raised of high levels of imputation. Okay, and so we came up with what we think should happen. We think that very poor quality variables should not be released because they're very poor and they have the potential to cause damage, and having them out there is great. Data rated overall as being of poor quality has the potential to mislead, and that such data should not be released as official statistics, but that access to data rated as poor should be restricted to accredited individuals working in controlled environments who are able to work closely with Stats New Zealand to understand the quality of the data. All right, we'll forget about the guidelines then. What are some of the guidelines we came up with? That they need to work better with Māori and Pacific populations to restore trust and make sure that the census goes well next time. Really look into, if you are looking at trends over time, to make sure that the no information categories aren't causing you to overestimate the degree of change. Watch out if you're using imputed data and perhaps consider, which is possible, multiple imputation. They will flag when they release data, so you do know. Yes, maybe I'll just stop there, but read the 3 reports, only 300 pages combined, and the census. But in the interest of time, and insofar as we can do the recording link to the slides, we'll do that as well. Yeah?
How different do you think there are issues in relation to enumeration across different age groups? I think it was highlighted a little bit towards the end in some of the variables.
Enumeration across different age groups for age itself or for other variables?
For population size.
I think they rated the age variable, and we agree with this, is very high. So the age is fine itself. But people of young ages will have data for other variables that are grabbed from other places. And so that will affect the quality of those variables, and it will be differential by age. So you may be seeing, you have to be cautious with age effects then, or ethnic effects, or region effects.
I can see arguments in both ways. So if kids that are 5 and older, they should be able to there should be good data coming from schools, because most kids are enrolled in school.
Yep.
You should be able to actually have good data on the under 5 age population, but I think you questioned it in one of your slides. You've got the birth data.
They did grab the birth data. What I was questioning is relationship statuses within families that the family variables rely on, and they just look plain weird. And we know they look weird because we looked at things called warrant of fitness for variables, where they took us into, we got a sort of snapshot of what the data were looking like. Age itself is fine, but quality will be differential by age because response is differential by age.
So if they're calling on 2013 and IDI data, how are they coping with migrants who may not have been in the system long enough or who have left the system?
Well, the IDI has pretty good information on who's leaving the country and who's coming back in, because that causes you're in contact with the system when you leave the country and contact with the system when you come in. And if you come in and live in a cave and don't access any services, then you probably won't be counted in this IDI ERP Shore population that I think exists. But it's not too bad. But you're right, there will be, and there's other weird things as well where you can get into the country without a visa stamp if you are coming from a country that New Zealand has an agreement with, such as the realm countries in the Pacific, where you can come in without getting a visa stamp and sort of no one knows you're there unless you start paying tax or doing something else. And so young children get missed that way and get missed in the IDI spine for that way.
Just a general question. If it was you wanted to build a 2019 cohort of the total New Zealand population, would you use the census to start knowing?
Well, I do this sort of thing, and I use something akin to the IDI ERP, I don't call it SURE, but the IDI Estimate Resident Population, which uses basically does it look like you're in the country because you're actually doing things that the system knows about in the country? And so the problems of denominators, which is essentially the problem you're asking about, are common to researchers. So I work in the IDI, so I use the IDI. But in terms of a count of the population, the one that they've come up with, if you need it for analysis and you're working in IDI microdata, I think that's fine. If you just want to, well, how many people are in the country, I think their estimate is pretty good, and also their estimate of how many are missed is pretty good.
I was going to ask, I think you mentioned it towards the end about when you're working within the IDI, whether there's flags for the various things they do. So when you go into the census file within the IDI, can you see what variables have been imputed versus enumerated or?
Watch this space, because it hasn't been released yet.
Yeah.
Should be released in the next couple of weeks, but my understanding is yes. Which means essentially, if you think about it, you've got a file of variables that is this wide, it now becomes this wide, because for every variable, you've got cases down this way, variables going across this way. Is for this variable, where do we get that information from? For this variable, where do we get that information from? My understanding, and there's something I raised a couple of times, is that that will be in there. And they know that because actually a link that's on this slide takes you to source of information by variable. And they know that at the individual level.
At the individual
Yes.
level, yeah.
Yeah, so yes, that will be released at the individual level. You know that this particular person, we didn't get the information from 2018 census, we imputed it. I'll just go to the back first. Yeah.
Sorry. Great talk. Good to see that overview of what went wrong potentially and what some solutions are. Where do you think, or are any of the recommendations about the social license and how they can manage that for the future to bring us along forward?
Yes, there were recommendations about social, at least one. Again, the 23, and I don't know them all by heart. I'm pretty sure there was one on social license, but yes, so we did to touch on that thing. As I said, we were tasked with talking about data quality, but we didn't think we could do that without thinking through, should you be doing this, or should you carry the public along with you? And we think they should. So there's various recommendations about consultation and social license and that sort of thing.
This is a follow-on question about the quality of addresses that were used in their mail sources as well, and is that being addressed?
They had a good, the quality of addresses. There were issues with the address list, I believe, and has that being addressed? Well, they've got another 3 years to do it, I suppose, in time for the next census. They did have a really good dwelling frame. They had a good sense of what built dwellings there were in the country, so they know where to go if they decided to actually go back that approach again. But they did. We and also the what went wrong with the census report people said they didn't use that to its fullest. Sorry.
Oh yeah, just to address the question over here about the data sources. Auckland Council, we did actually get a custom order looking at territorial authority, local board level of which variables, which came from which sources. So some of that's quite sort of enlightening and a bit concerning also. Some of the southern local boards, for example, the travel to work, I think the main means was sort of down to about 30% imputation.
Yeah.
So it's quite, which actually sort of suggests the question I was going to ask of you, Barry, about a lot of the data info plus guidance of, this variable is good, this variable is bad. Dwelling type, for example, says it has been checked to regional council level.
Yeah.
Below that, you may find some variability, which concerns me a little bit. And I wonder if you got any thoughts on, is there some variable where they've imputed so much percentage at the smaller levels that you shouldn't use that?
Well, that's where the information that they're giving you will help. In the link in there, you can link to, not the degree I wanted, but certainly the lowest SA2 in every region about the level of imputation for a particular variable or level of admin data use or 2013 census use. What I wanted is to make it all singing and dancing. So you could choose the SA2 you wanted, 2,000 in the country, computationally it's not that difficult to do, and see, for this particular variable, for this particular community, what's the level of imputation or what's the level of admin data use. We were running against time. Yeah, if we had another 2 months and I was in control, then